So today we're going to cover the last three stages of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model. So last week we talked about the setup to the 5 stages, kind of her take on our fear and attitudes towards death and dying, and then the initial 2 stages that a dying patient will often go through, the denial and isolation stage, and the stage of anger, where their anger towards their plight comes out. So we'll kind of recap those at the end. So we'll just kind of move into the third stage, just to start us off. So the third stage of grief, this third stage of grief, third stage of dying in Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's model is bargaining. So sorry, I'm gonna just zoom in a little bit if I can. Okay. So this typically comes after the first 2 stages, the denial of and then anger at the fact of one's death, right? This is, if we recall, these stages are about the dying patient, right? You're facing your own death. You've had a terminal diagnosis. And after getting angry, after denying this reality, people often go to this stage of bargaining. Okay, so the dying patient begins by this sort of invoking this internal, intrinsic, kind of natural fear and resistance and defensiveness towards their own mortality and death, by saying, you got the wrong person, you got the wrong guy, you got the wrong girl. It can't be me, right? This denial that we remember from last week, and of course this is just natural, right? This is just our own fear, our own inability to even really think about and contemplate our own death. Really kind of comes out in this initial stage, right, where we get this diagnosis, this determination, hey, you're dying before you thought you were. Of course, we all kind of have this abstract idea. We can kind of acknowledge this, what seems like this abstract truth, that we're all going to die. Everybody's mortal. Everybody dies. And then we just kind of ignore it and move on. As she said, we just kind of push this away. Our society helps us do that, the way it's structured. But it's still in there. It's still underneath this fear, defensiveness, inability to really accept our own death. That really facilitates this denial. And our own defensiveness towards our own death can make it so that the non-dying person, the patient's family, clinicians, clergy even, just our own natural fear and defensiveness towards death itself and our own death can make the people around the patients sort of that can facilitate the patient's denial. So if you yourself are afraid, as a nurse, a doctor, whoever else, a family member, are afraid to confront death because of your own fear of your own death, then it will be very hard for you to help the patient get through their denial, to come to accept and at least acknowledge the fact of this reality, right, that they're dying. So our own defensiveness towards our own death can actually facilitate the patient's denial and isolation. We can embrace their isolation, right? She talked about nurses who would, she didn't use these terms, but nurses who would essentially embrace the patient's desire to be isolated and just try to not think about these things, not want to talk about treatment plans and all this stuff, because it's easier. It's easier to deal with an isolated patient who's not really confronting their own death, because then you don't have to think about the terrible fact of their death and the sadness and all these other things, right? But once we've accepted, at least, let me change this, because once acknowledged, right? Because acceptance is going to be a different thing. So it's just a terminological thing. So we'll talk about acceptance below. And there is a kind of acceptance here once we move from denial to anger, and then from anger to bargaining, and I'll talk about that, but I'll try to call it acknowledgement. So because it's different from what she calls acceptance. But there is a kind of acknowledgement, right? Once denial is kind of put behind you, at least a little bit. And again, you can come back and forth between these initial stages. You can go from denial to anger to depression to anger to depression to denial and so on. But when you at least even if it's temporary, when you move to anger away from denial, or even if you move to depression away from denial or bargaining or whatever, there is a kind of acknowledgement. That's just what it is to kind of move away from denial, is that you're acknowledging the reality to some extent that you're going to die. And this is why you become angry. It doesn't really make sense to become angry at the fact you're going to die if you're still in denial, right? If you still haven't even acknowledged the fact that you're going to die. So this move from denial to anger, or in more sort of general terms, the move away from denial, is a kind of acknowledgement of some sort, or to some extent at least. And so you move to this idea that it's not fair. Okay, I'm going to die, but that's not fair, right? It's not fair. Why me? And as opposed to somebody else, right? And so you do have a little denial that hangs around, though. So there's this kind of blend through these, I think through these the second, third, and fourth stage anyways, have this kind of blend of denial hanging around. At least through the second and third stage of anger and bargaining, as we'll see. And as you move to acceptance, there's a kind of greater and greater sort of acknowledgement of your condition, of your reality. So denial does hang around a little bit because you're not denying the fact that you're going to die, at least not fully anymore, but more like denying the fact that it's really fair. Like, what the heck? Why me? Okay, I'm going to die, but this isn't fair. So you're denying that there's, it's really supposed to be your turn that's up, right? And then that fosters this anger. And anger comes out at others in a way that denial really doesn't. Denial is more, that she talks about it as more of a kind of a personal thing, that you can't really accept it. Of course, you engage with other people and talk to them, but anger really just kind of comes out. When we get angry at things, especially if we're still partially in denial at them, and when the denial is turned towards fairness, right? You're angry because you think, what the hell? I don't deserve this. It's not my time. There's an injustice happening here. And that will make you angry. And when you don't have a way to make sense of it, right? You're angry partly because you can't make sense of what's going on. You recognize what's going on, but you're like, I just don't see how this could be happening to me. Then that makes the anger come out. Okay. But then our fight against our own death, this resistance that we have, this natural defensiveness towards our own death, initially comes out in denying and then anger, but then it sort of turns to trying to make a deal. And this is where bargaining comes in. Okay. And again, I say typically comes after denial is because she allows these things to happen in out of order. It's unclear, I think, at least from what we've read so far in her book, that whether she thinks you can start at another stage. I would imagine that she would think that that's possible. Maybe you can start at anger, you could start at depression. But denial typically comes first. But the typical part is just bringing back up again this idea that this is not supposed to be a mechanical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 process, right? You can jump around. But eventually, or sort of, I should say, commonly or more ordinarily, you'll see denial and anger, and then this turn to making a deal. Trying to make a deal with whoever is in charge, right? Whoever is in charge, whether you're religious and that's God, or if you're religious and you think, there's this saying, right? You make a deal with the devil. And so whoever it is, if you're not religious, the universe, if it's many gods, if it's the universe is God, whatever the idea there is about religion or spirituality or whatever, there's oftentimes something that's supposed to be kind of in charge. And even for an atheist, I think the universe, you're angry at that the universe kind of unfolded in this way. And of course you might even, this is just a really human thing to do, but you might even imbue some personality to the universe. Like, how could the universe let this happen? as if the universe has some agency, right? So it doesn't really matter if you're religious or not. You will still look to whoever or whatever is in charge, right? And you'll try to make a deal. So denial and anger sort of are the outward expressions of this really heavy resistance that we have. This, as she calls it, the defensiveness towards our own death, right? But then we start to kind of turn a corner here and do a little bit more acknowledging, right? I'll change this again. Let's see if I can carry. So anyway, sorry, I got caught up in these little things. So we start to turn a corner, okay? We start to really kind of acknowledge the truth of our own death, of our own mortality, right? But again, denial is going to hang around a little bit. There, I'm able to do it. See, it bugs me. So we're able to acknowledge much more even than in the anger stage, right? There is a really kind of, it doesn't really make sense to bargain about your death if you're not sort of in a much stronger acknowledgement than even in the anger stage of the fact that you're going to die, of the reality that has hit you, right? But in the fact that you're bargaining means that you're not fully acknowledging that the reality is kind of there to stay, right? Maybe that the reality is amendable. Okay, so you do acknowledge that the reality is present, but there's a kind of pushback against the sort of absoluteness of this reality, right? That the fact is there, but maybe we can modify that fact or create it or change it into a new fact, right? And so you try to strike a deal with God or the God, whoever it is, the universe, God, whoever, and you say things like, "Well, I promise I'll be better if you just let me get through this," right? I'll do such and such. Just give me a cure, find a treatment, please let the doctors figure something out, right? She mentions that this is a very, very common one. People who, just most people are religious, but of different kinds, but even people who aren't may sort of come around in some way and promise. Even, this is a good example, right? Someone who's not religious may promise to be religious. God, if you're out there listening, please get me through this, and I swear I'll believe in you, or something like that, right? So this idea that you're trying to strike a deal, that you're trying to bargain or negotiate your way through this predicament. There's this sort of mix of, it presupposes that you acknowledge the reality. You can't bargain about some fact if you don't acknowledge that fact is real. It doesn't make sense to say, if you let me survive this, then I'll do such and such, if you don't already accept that you're not going to survive, right? It doesn't make any sense. So it presupposes a kind of acknowledgement, but you still let this denial hang around, and you feel like, well, this fact is not final or absolute. Maybe it can be pushed back in some way. Okay. And she gives a kind of analogy of this move from denial to anger to bargaining that we see, through those stages that we see in kids. And she's done this before. She seems to think that dying patients or people who are facing their imminent death, I don't know if she wants to say kind of reverts back to childhood. She has a psychoanalytic kind of background, which is a kind of Freudian or Jungian or in that area kind of training background, it seems like. And so this reversion to childlike states and childlike intuitions and feelings and natural instinctive sort of tendencies, when she's talking about this instinctive fear of death in the denial and anger chapters, she makes the same kind of an analogy to children, the way in which children sort of naturally think. So she likes to make this analogy, but actually kind of like this example that she gives, this analogy, is this bargaining represents this habit that we've learned through our childhood, through our upbringing, typically, and then just through sort of ordinary life. We learn that you can seek rewards, or you can seek the avoidance of punishment through doing good things, satisfying the people who may give you those rewards, who were inclined to punish you but may not if you do other things good that they like or that you're supposed to do or whatever it is, right? If you think of like the example of doing community service or paying a fine instead of going to jail, right? It's a kind of reward. Like, okay, you're about to be punished. You're about to get a punishment for something you did. It's like, well, let me do this other thing, all this other thing, so that you don't give me this punishment that you're about to give me. Give me no punishment, or give me a lesser punishment, or give me something else, right? So this is very common. I mean, we see this all over the place. And her example is, you think of a child, right? Child asks, let's say, to go spend the night at a friend's house or to get a new toy or whatever it is, and the parent just says, no, you're not getting that. Here's the reality. You're not going to your friend's house tonight. Or here's the reality. You're not getting that brand new gaming system or whatever it is. And very common, the first reaction is, are you freaking kidding me? Are you serious? Like, just straight denial, right? You have to be joking that I'm not going to my friend's house, right? This, like, what's the joke here? What's wrong with you? Like, did you hear what I said? You can't be serious, right? That's the first reaction. And then the shift to, once they realize you're not budging, right? No, I'm serious, dead serious. You're not going. It shifts to, oh my God, you're so terrible. I hate you. The world's against me. Maybe stopping their foot and running off and slamming the door and going into their bedroom. Isolation, right? Denial, isolation, anger coming out, right? Maybe a little journal, something really angrily about their parents. And then once you're able to move a little bit past this denial and anger stage, you come to bargaining. The kids thought about it for a minute, and maybe they're still a little angry, and maybe they're still in a little bit of denial. And again, it's at least this kind of denial, right? This denial that this is absolute. There's a little bit of negotiability here, right? And so the kid comes out and says, well, what if I do my chores, early this week, or I do double chores this week, or I promise I'll eat all my vegetables, or whatever, however old the kid is. They make all these promises, right? This trying to bargain their way into changing this fact, this reality over here, that they're just not going, or that they're just not getting the toy. Try to make a deal, right? They're like, okay, I get it that I'm not going to get the toy, but I'm not going to get the toy as of right now, right? And you might think of a patient thinking, okay, fine, I get it. I'm going to die. As of right now, the fact is I'm going to die. But maybe we can change that. Or maybe we can push that back, right? I won't go stay at my friend's house next week. Let me do it this week, and then I won't ask again for another 2 weeks or the rest of the month or whatever, right? Pushing off this fact that they don't like, right? I really like this example. It's a good way to illustrate this shift from denial and anger to bargaining. And I do think it is really intuitive that we do see this in our everyday life, and especially in children. It's a good example. Okay, so bargaining, she says, if we look at the way in which it happens, it's kind of interesting. It often starts really, really big and then turns to kind of something more manageable or reasonable. So they'll often start by just bargaining for their life, right? The fact that they want to change is the whole entire fact, right? What's negotiable, what seems to be negotiable at first is this whole entire fact that they're going to die. Not thinking they're immortal, but that their imminent death is approaching. Okay, my death is no longer imminent. I'm going to die at some later time, unknown to anyone, just like everyone else, right? Well, beat this cancer, right? Let me find a cure, or let the doctors find a cure. Let me actually make it through this cancer and fully beat it, and then I'll do all these different things, right? Find me a miracle treatment, and I'll do all these things, God, right? A kind of sort of more original initial denial seems to be hanging around here. But then once they sort of further acknowledgement, right, of their mortality, further acknowledgement of this fact, right, it starts sticking a little more, kind of turns the bargaining towards something else. Okay, I just want to see my family one more time. I just want to play one more concert. I think she spoke of an opera singer, right, who had to get surgery on her face because of her cancer, and had her teeth removed, and this sort of acknowledgement that I was away, and I was a person with a life and a purpose, and I'm not going to get to do that anymore. And so wait, just okay, I'm going to die. Fine. I'm not trying to not die here, but just let me do this thing one more time, and then I'll be okay, right? And then realizing that, that may not even happen. Maybe you won't even see someone, you like, please just let me make it to my son's wedding or whatever it is, right? And then you realize that may not even happen. And so eventually you start bargaining for just personal little comforts. Like, God, just please let me have a painless day today. Or, please let me just wake up tomorrow. Give me another day. Let me get through this surgery, without any complications. These kinds of little things, right? And then eventually you move to postponing the death, or having the death go their way, right? Because it's like, just want more time. Just, oh gosh, just let me have one more day, all these kinds of things. But then just let me die in peace, or let me settle a few things before I die, right? So it kind of shifts from this sort of big denial of the fact that you're going to die. Please don't let me die, right? I'll do anything. Switching to, well, let me just have a little bit more life. Okay, fine. Just let me kind of die in peace in my own way. Give me a little bit more comfort, a little bit less pain. You start making these deals, right? And she also says that these promises, that the patient's end of the bargain is often never met, right? They say, just get me through this surgery, get me through the week, and with minimal pain, and then I swear I won't ask for anything else. And then you get through the week, and it's less pain than you were feeling before. Maybe the treatments are doing better this week, but then of course the next week you're asking for more things, right? So she's the bargaining has a tendency to go one way. So there's this question of whether bargaining represents a sense of guilt. So she says, and it's kind of my question, because she seems to suggest that the patients negotiate their deaths in a way that suggests that they're guilty about something, right? That they feel really bad about, like, maybe it's their fault that they're dying, or maybe they feel guilty because they didn't get to do something that they wanted to do. There's a problem with their like a rift in their family, and that something like that. So she says, someone guilty about their relationship with God might promise to dedicate their life to religion, right? Or someone that might feel guilty about, say, a rift in the family, maybe a father and son, or a grandparent and grandchild, or a spouse even. Maybe there's some rift there, and they haven't talked in forever, or they haven't dealt with some issue in forever, and there's been some strife or something in the relationship, and they now have been diagnosed amid all this with some terminal illness, and so they now feel guilty. They feel guilty that they're not going to be able to deal with this. They feel guilty the attention's on them, and maybe they feel guilty because they think that their family member has to sort of ignore this rift that was caused and just focus on them. There's a kind of guilt that can come with this, and she seems to suggest that this bargaining is a kind of a way of expressing some guilt and trying to get time, or to get something resolved. And so there's this question. I mean, is guilt always this way? She seems to give a few examples where guilt can be this way. So you might just ask yourself, is in kind of two ways you can ask the question. Does Kubler-Ross really think that the bargaining stage is a kind of expression of a person's guilt in some way? If not necessarily every time, then does she think that that's kind of really common, or the sort of standard way in which guilt is expressed through this bargaining stage? Or you might ask, so the first question is, does she think that? And the second question is that something plausible that might actually be going on? Is this bargaining stage always supposed to be a kind of expression of guilt? And what would the dying patient be feeling guilty about, right? Do they have unfinished business? Are they like guilty because they're leaving their family? Or more specifically, like guilty because they're leaving their family when there's some strife going on? Maybe they feel guilty because they caused the situation. Maybe it's like lung cancer from smoking and they feel guilty. Maybe they feel guilty because their life they feel like they didn't really live their life the way that they wanted to or should have, according to themselves or according to God or according to someone else, their family, whatever. What might they be feeling guilty about? And do you think that Kubler-Ross takes this bargaining stage to really be caught up with an expression of guilt? Those are questions that you might ask yourself. But that's the bargaining stage. Right? So the shift from denial and anger, which expresses this kind of lack of acknowledgement of the fact before them of their death, and that shifting and sort of turning into this acknowledgement of the fact, but without the acknowledgement that this fact is final, right? And maybe sometimes understandably, because some people make it through cancers, even bad cancers, at least temporarily, and sometimes get cured. It goes into remission and never comes back, maybe, right? So there are these things that can happen, and so maybe it's not totally wild at first for them to think like, okay, I'm dying, but maybe there's some cure, right? And so there is a kind of denial that hangs around, but in this stage, it hangs around in a form of sort of the patient themselves psychologically trying to negotiate with God, with whoever, to try to shift this fact into something more agreeable to the patient, right? And then this final point about bargaining possibly being this expression of guilt. Okay. So then, after bargaining, the patient, again, typically they can jump around, right? But from bargaining, tends to be this shift into depression. And what it is again going to be a kind of a further and deeper kind of acknowledgement of the fact. And this further and deeper acknowledgement of the fact, this time brings a little bit more sadness. So when denial and anger and bargaining can't obscure the reality of their death anymore, the reality of the fact that they are going to die imminently, then a kind of depression sets in. Right? And part of the function of this stage, part of the function of the first three stages is to block out that depression, is to block out that sadness, right? We are afraid of death. We are defensive towards death because it seems to us a really, really probably the greatest loss, right? Death itself typically seems like the greatest loss to us, but then our own death is even worse, right? Because it's not just thinking about someone else suffering the greatest loss. It's us suffering the greatest loss and losing the ability to experience anything anymore, you might think, at least in a certain sense. Right? So the part of denial and anger and bargaining, part of what they do, right, is to try to put up this wall against these really sad, upsetting truths. So once that wall starts to get broken down, right, again, this is, when I say denial sticks around, this is kind of like my phrase, it keeps hanging around in anger and bargaining, hangs around in anger because you're denying that it's really just or fair, this fact that you're going to die. And then in bargaining, you're denying that fact is absolute, that you're kind of trying to suggest that there's something that can be changed here still, whether it's the entire fact itself or just the timing or the way in which it might happen, peacefully or not. And so the function of these first to sort of keep that, sadness out, and that's kind of why denial sticks around. But eventually, you can't just fully deny any longer, right? You can't. You have, over time, this just happens, right? But also just your health is starting to deteriorate in front of you, and you're going through a bunch of treatments. So obviously, you can't deny the fact that you're sick and being treated, because there you are going through treatments, right? And all these different things just sort of speak further and further to speak more fully and more clearly to the reality that you're dying. And so it's just sort of practically really hard to deny the reality of your death in this kind of situation for very long. And as it sticks around, it wanes, right? It wanes. The denial and anger is different and less. The denial and bargaining is different and less. There's a sort of more fuller acknowledgement that starts to build. Okay, and that is the lowering of those denial walls, right? Just raises the acknowledgement of that fact, and it is indeed a sad fact. And so it's natural to think that depression would start to set in once denial starts to wane more and more through the anger and the bargaining. Okay, but it's not just depression at your own life coming to an end. Of course, it is depression at your own life coming to an end, but it's not just that, right? You're losing your life, but you're also losing other things. You're losing your health. Your body's deteriorating. You can't get up and move around the way you used to. You can't be autonomous, right? Taking care of yourself in the way that you used to. You need help with more and more things. Even fundamental things like just going to the bathroom, which is just a sad thing for someone to start realizing that they can't go to the bathroom by themselves anymore. It's one of the most sort of common, I mean, daily we're going to the bathroom, right? But it's one of the most common, natural, and sort of physical, body-oriented things that we do that is also one of the most private things that we do, right? We do it for ourselves all the time. And then you lose this function. And things like eating are the same way, right? We often do this on our own. Just think of snacking. If you eat like 3 meals with your family every day, okay, obviously you're not doing that by yourself, but this at least hunger and satisfaction of eating something. These are often things that are private, and especially going to the bathroom. These really natural kind of base things that humans have to do, right? They can be very private, but once you start losing the ability to take care of yourself, it just becomes really, really obvious that you're in trouble, because someone now has to come every time you have to go to the bathroom. Someone has to come help you, for instance, or bathe or eat, right? These simple things. And so it just starts becoming really obvious that your body is deteriorating and you can't do what you used to do. You're not the same person in a way, right? And so you can feel regretful. You can feel shameful even. Again, you can feel guilty at these people having to take care of you. You obviously might start having self-esteem issues. This just becomes really hard to deal with, right? These are also probably the things that might start breaking down your denial walls, right? And then it just becomes very depressing. Okay? But you're also losing other things. I mean, you're in the hospital dying, right? And so it's not clear that you can really have a job. This obviously becomes very expensive. She talks about people who have, like, give up their house, like literally a house that maybe they even built. It's been in their family, right? Maybe a house that they spent their life working towards and saved for, and they bought with their family and everything, and now they have to give that up because maybe that person was the main financial provider, and they're about to die, and so one, they're not going to be able to provide for that house anyways, but two, it's just really expensive to go through some of these end-of-life care things, treatments, and so on. And it's just, you might kind of think like, well, these are just material things, it's just they should be focused on their life and that sort of thing. But man, that's just really hard to do. Sure, maybe that's right, but that's just really psychologically hard to do when you're going through all this stuff. And so even things just recognizing how much money it's costing and the possessions and so on, that's just really hard to add on top of a terminal illness, right? So the point here is just that it's really should be unsurprising that once these denial walls break down and once you're not just expressing yourself through just getting really angry all the time, right? And then you get into kind of more fuller acknowledgement in the bargaining stage where you're like a little bit more accepting of the fact that you're going to die, but now you kind of want to change it and prolong it or whatever else. Once all that goes away, it's really easy to see how it could be very depressing and sad. Right? So she wants to note this kind of just carries, this next point just carries on this, like that there's two kinds of depressions that people can go through, or that people often go through in coming to terms with their own death, their own imminent death, which is, one has to do with kind of what we just talked about, what we'll call like these previous losses, the things that you've already lost. Once you're in this stage of acknowledging your death more and more, you start to realize and not just get angry and have fits about and in denial about, and try to negotiate about, like, oh, just give me my figure back and I'll, give me my face back how it was after some surgery, or, you might have to have your jaw removed for cancer, or like these crazy things, right? Once you sort of acknowledge the reality of those, you can just become depressed about that. Things you've already lost, right? Health, body, life dreams, right? You can't go on and be what you want to be anymore. Finances, job, right? And these are familiar to us. These make sense to us. These material losses, right? It's not that hard for us to figure out some fairly decent ways to deal with this stuff, right? Because people lose stuff all the time that are important to them, and people know people, family members, friends, and so on, who have lost things that are important to them. Again, not death, right? But material sorts of things about themselves, right? About possessions that they have or whatever. We know kind of how to deal with this, right? And we're good at kind of figuring out what's bothering someone with stuff like this. So someone looks depressed or sad or upset by something, and if they say, "Oh yeah, my mom died," okay, that's heavy, and we may not really know how to deal with that. But if they're like, "Yeah, I lost my job today," we're gonna have a much easier time at least attempting to make them feel better, right? And maybe even helping them come up with solutions, but at least making them feel better, right? Like, oh gosh, the economy's bad right now. Lots of people who are really competent, and good at what they do or whatever are losing their jobs. So it's like, it doesn't say anything about you. There's lots of other jobs out there. We can do this kind of thing for these sort of material losses, right? We refocus their attention to their family if they've had a career loss, right? Gosh, I'm terminal now. I'm not going to be able to, take the opera singer, go and continue my career as an opera singer. Like, well, focus their attention to their family. Look, you have so much. It's just a career. You have so much else of value in your life, right? And their self-esteem if their body is deteriorating. Like, compliment them on other things, right? If they're guilty, we can reassure them. Hey, we're going to be okay. Don't worry about us. Focus on you. We're good at this kind of thing. This is what they've already lost, right? Look at the bright side of life. This is kind of, we're pretty good at that. And again, this has to do with, it's at least related to what Elisabeth Kubler-Ross says earlier on, which is like our ability to deny death. We're like really good as individuals and as a society at denying death. And so this kind of part of what comes with that, whether it's cause or effect, is this other ability to focus on stuff that makes us feel good, right? To focus on the bright side of life. And so we're just naturally really good at that. And so when we have, a family member or a patient, if we're a doctor or a nurse, who is dealing with this kind of depression, this depression in the sense of things previously lost, your health, your body, your dreams, your finances, and so on, we can do this kind of look at the bright side of life comfort or strategy for comforting them, for making them feel better, right? But there's a different kind. There's a different kind of depression that she says is not about these previous material losses, but it's about these impending losses. And mainly two, or at least kind of two general descriptions of the things that you're going to lose. One, yourself, your life, right? There's still the impending loss of your life. And again, as we've said, we're just not very good at dealing with that. At least most people in their kind of natural tendencies, natural inclinations. We like to avoid death, be defensive of death. We're afraid of death, right? So we're not very good at that. So this, what she calls preparatory grief, about these impending losses, right? We can't just be like, oh, look, the future is so bright, because it's not. That's not the right way to deal with this, because they're going to die. And that's what they're depressed about. When they're depressed about stuff they've lost, but they're still alive, right? You could say like, oh, don't worry about those things. You still have your life right now. Let's try to make it the best we can. Look at the bright side. Well, if we shift to the grief about their impending loss of life, the future is not so bright. And right, sort of in line with that, is this impending loss of literally everything that they love. They're going to die. So whatever it is that they love in this world, family, job, objects, whatever, they're going to lose them because they're going to die. So this look at the bright side, right? These encouragements, reassurances, they're just not very useful. That's just denial. To tell the patient, just look at the bright side of things, that's just denying these impending losses. It's just denying the reality of the fact that the person is grieving about their own loss of life and about the fact that that means they're going to lose all the things in this world that they love. And just denying that, she says, these are roughly her words, it hinders their ability to emotionally prepare for those losses. It doesn't really do that here. The bright side of life stuff doesn't hinder your emotional ability to accept those losses. They're already lost, right? And they're just material things. So it doesn't really do harm, really. It can even just help. And it's kind of a good way to help people get over stuff like that. But here, it's not. It seems sort of dishonest to tell them to not be sad and grieving about the fact that they're going to die and lose all the things that they love, right? So not very good. So some other means of addressing this, it just kind of comes back to just being with them, understanding them, talking to them. She really kind of emphasizes in one sort of portion of this chapter that silence is really key. Nonverbal communication becomes important here. It will become even more important with acceptance, but when someone's in this depressed state, we don't want to just try to look at the bright side of life and cheer them up, right? We want to be with them, hold their hand, stroke their hair, she says. Just listen, just be together with them, right? Again, it's dishonest if you try to push down or suppress their sadness. Be there with them in their sadness. Maybe even be sad together. These are the kinds of things that she thinks are important for a person that's grieving and depressed about these two kind of most important impending losses: the loss of their own life and the loss of everything that they love in this world. Okay, and this kind of depression cannot be denied. It's important for it to come out, to recognize the value of their life. That's what they're so upset about, right? And again, part of the depression can be about guilt and shame and regret and so on for maybe not having lived life the way that they wanted. And so recognizing the value of their life, recognizing that the loss of their life is a loss of something of great value. And you should be sad about that. Or at least, maybe not should be, but it kind of should be, right? It's very normal and reasonable. It makes sense to be sad about that because your life is really valuable. And this can be a kind of way to acknowledge the depression, but fight against it as well. Because you're acknowledging the great value of their life, right? And of the relationships that they had that are going to come to an end soon. So letting that depression come out can be kind of healing in a way. She says navigating this stage is, she doesn't say necessary, but it seems to, what she says seems to imply that this navigating the stage of depression is really necessary for getting to acceptance, the final stage. So she says something like, the patient really can't get to sort of full, genuine acceptance and peace, which is kind of an entailment of acceptance, you can't really get that unless you work your way through to the depression. Okay. So the depression is a kind of a way of sort of pushing one's hope down, right? So there's a kind of hanging on to hope in the early stages, and this is why you get, this is where denial comes from. It's a kind of hope that this is really not true, right? This is really not my reality. And then you get angry. Maybe that's a kind of losing of some of the hope, a hope that the fact wasn't real, right? But then bargaining, there's a hope. There's hope comes back, right? You're hoping that there's some cure. You're hoping that you have more life. But here, there's a kind of hope for something else. The depression is, again, kind of a more full acknowledgement of the facts here, which are very sad and depressing facts. But touching on this value to their life and the kind of sense that it makes to be depressed about the loss of it can also give them a kind of hope for the meaning that their life had. Right? This shifting the hope from a hope to continue and a hope to live and a hope that this fact isn't really a fact, and shifting that to a hope that this hope that my life meant something, right? Has meaning now because it had meaning when I lived it. And so you can kind of bring a sort of value to their life, right? So, but the point of that is, because acceptance really becomes about this backwards looking thing that we'll see. Depression is this backwards looking thing that sort of shifts us into an acceptance. And we'll see what that acceptance holds for us. But this depression really starts to become a backwards looking thing, where the whole time we were kind of looking forward, denying, hoping that it's not true, hoping that we have more life, right? And then depression sits in and it starts pushing backwards. What are all the things I've lost? These sort of previous material losses. And the present moment makes them really clear that you're not the person you used to be. You don't have the things you used to have. You're not going where you used to be going. And then, of course, this depression against the fact that you are going to die and you're going to lose everything you love, which is also turns to a kind of backwards looking thing. Was my life, I'm going to lose my life. Was it what I wanted it to be? Was it meaningful? I'm going to lose everything I love, right? Including, most importantly, these relationships I have with other people that I love. Were they what I wanted them to be? Are there any rifts that I haven't fixed yet? Did I lose relationships I wish I hadn't? And can I get them back? These are the kinds of things that are coming towards come through in this depression. And it's about the sort of navigating the stage becomes about what we do with this hope. And shifted away from this denial and bargaining sort of hope where we're still sort of denying the reality, and shift it to an acceptance of the depression because, look, this is a depressing thing. Let's be real, right? But then instilling that hope, that backwards hope. You did have meaning. You are worth something. Right? And navigating that stage, instilling that hope in the meaning and the value of their life is, I think, what she thinks kind of this necessary thing to get to acceptance, right? You have to deal with this anguish, this death anxiety in order to get to acceptance. Okay. So kind of what to do, right? So preparatory depression, this second kind of depression right here, preparatory grief, impending losses, the two great impending losses. It starts by looking forward at what will be lost, but it turns backwards, as we just said, turns backwards on your own life. And so you think things like, given that I'll be gone soon, did I do all I could? Given that I'm going to lose everything, are my relationships what they should be? And what she says is, this is going to bring us back to this all-encompassing, all-important way in which she thinks is one of the most central things that we should do to deal with dying patients is getting to know them and valuing their experience, valuing it by validating it and letting them have it and share it, but also just being interested in it, being interested in knowing what their experience is like so that you can understand what they need, so that you can help other people like them in the future. But we can't know how to deal with people who are going through things like this. We can't be successful at knowing those things if we don't understand, the patient. Okay. Modernity is a problem, in part, at least, because it dehumanizes. It's about numbers and not the experience. Prolonging life and not meaningful life. Right? So, coming back to the patient experience and humanization is going to be key for her for every stage, really, for this whole sort of general approach to how we deal with the dying patients. Right? That's what all these interviews are about. Nobody talked to these people. They were numbers. And she thought, why don't we just start by going and talking to them? Right? And so getting to know their life, their losses, their what are they afraid of? What kinds of unfinished business do they have? Right? That is one of the most effective ways to address the depression, to address the whole sort of process through these stages in general. Remember from anger, like, why are they angry? Understanding the source of their anger. Understanding them can help us understand their bargaining, right? The way in which they bargain might tell us something about them. And knowing something about them might help us understand their bargaining and helping them get through it and deal with it, right? And so, but in particular the depression, because again, the depression starts to turn backwards really heavily, and it starts to do it in a way that's in this context of being really sad and depressed because there's much more full acknowledgement of what's going on. Okay, and so the effective way to do that, the most effective way to get to know them, to help them, is to get to know them. Okay. Once we shift through these first 4 stages, which oftentimes are going to be jumped around, we come to acceptance. And let's try to understand what she means by that. So the path to acceptance, again, is through the first 4 stages. So in general, people will work through these stages. Sometimes they'll skip them, right? Sometimes they'll skip them. Again, that's going to be allowed. Some people might skip bargaining or whatever. But if a patient is in a stage, if they do get into bargaining, if they do get into anger, if they do get into depression, which is probably one of the more common ones outside of denial, the patient has to work through them in order to reach acceptance. If they skip if they skip depression, if they skip bargaining, whatever, okay, fine, they skipped it. Maybe some people do that. But if they don't, if there's some denial, if some anger starts coming out, if someone starts bargaining, if they get depressed, that needs to be worked through before we can get to acceptance. I mean, she's pretty clear about that. Okay. Denial subsides through the stages, as we mentioned, right? So denial's there. It's going to be this initial sort of thing that she might argue probably almost no one skips because it comes from this really deep natural fear we have towards our own death. But it starts subsiding as you move through the stages because, again, it's this more and more acknowledgement of the reality. And it's able to subside because you don't need to just cut off denial. If you remember, she says, embrace the denial if it helps them. If it helps them and it doesn't disrupt treatment and taking their medication and so on, embrace it when you can. Because it helps them. It helps them reduce it sort of slowly over the stages. And that's the way in which we can get through it, is just help it subside slowly. Come slowly to the acknowledgement that you're actually dying. And get us to depression so we can recognize the seriousness of this and then get through that, right? But getting through anger and bargaining, this is about really sort of learning that anger and bargaining aren't really going to work. that you can't just get mad at your death and then that's going to make it go away. Right? You can't just make a deal with the devil or whoever else and make this go away. You're not just going to make it go away. And that's what all three really, denial, anger, and bargaining are in a way trying to make this go away. And once you realize you can't do that, I mean, part of this is helped through just the doctors and nurses and clinicians and so on continuing to talk to the patient, continuing through the treatments and stuff. And just as a matter of time, I mean, you'll just start to recognize, okay, this is really real. I'm continuing to go through this. But using other strategies to sort of help them realize, getting to know them again is going to be important, that these things aren't going to do what they think they're going to do. Anger and bargaining aren't going to make it go away. And so getting through that gets us to depression, where you're looking back and you're trying to figure out if there's any hope that your life was meaningful and the way you wanted it to go. Like, that's kind of the worry in depression. Right? So, getting through, understanding the patient, talking to them, communicating with them and their family, and getting clear on what kinds of unfinished business they have, the kinds of things that they're hung up on, what do they regret, did their life have meaning. Getting through these stages here is the path towards acceptance. And what she wants to say is, you really can't work through these. You really can't get to acceptance if you don't work through these. She really kind of emphasizes that point. Only after this work you do through denial, anger, and depression can you fully accept these two serious losses, that you're going to die and that you're going to lose everything that you love. Okay, and this is just the note I mentioned earlier. All right, so she notes, importantly, that we should not see acceptance as contentment. It's not that people are happy that they're going to die. It's not even that they become content that they're going to die, that they're okay, satisfied. It's not necessarily like that. Okay? It's not like the patient says, okay, I understand now. My death isn't bad. My death is good. Maybe some people think that. I mean, certainly that's a philosophical view, that death's not bad. And people believe that. It's unclear how much that can hang around in an actual case where someone's terminally ill, but people can think that. But it's not really about that. Acceptance is not about seeing the good in your dying. Okay. She even says it's typically not really feeling full at all. There's not a whole lot of feeling going on. It's not about being joyous or happy or content or whatever else. It's more like the cessation of all the shit that came before. I mean, that's one way of putting it. Just think of the stages we've gone through so far. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. A lot of serious feelings, a lot of serious trouble, harm, sadness. Heavy stuff. And acceptance, the good in acceptance is not like a feeling of goodness for the person and a feeling of like, my death is good and it's great, this is a great thing now. The goodness in acceptance is a kind of elimination of all that other stuff. It's just ending the struggle and the resistance. Right? Even the emotional and psychological struggle and resistance to whether or not you've done all you could and your life was meaningful, coming to that sort of at least hope, if not belief, that your life is meaningful, right, is also a kind of giving up of that struggle. And so that's why the emphasis there was kind of a hope. The shift is from a hope that you'll live on to a hope that your life is meaningful. And I think it's a hope in part because, you might not fully solve that problem, at least not satisfactorily to yourself. But as long as you can have this hope, you see kind of some reason to think that, okay, I've done all I could, my life was meaningful, and this sense of, it almost sounds like unbelievable, but this sense of, okay, I'm ready. That end of that struggle to resist death, that may just be void of feelings, and you just want to go now. That's the good part. That's the acceptance. It's good that you're not struggling and in anguish and anxiety anymore. And she uses this. She says it's very common for people who are coming to their acceptance stage to start to, or are in their acceptance stage, to start sleeping more and more, kind of more regularly, and not. So she notes explicitly, she's like, this is not like sleeping more in depression. Like there's a common symptom of depression is oversleeping. People who are depressed, they sleep a lot, feel like they don't have. It's part of it because you don't have energy, but also sort of mental energy, right? You just, nothing seems really worth getting up for and whatever else. It's not like that. It's not like they're depressed and are just like, ugh, whatever. There's nothing to live for. I don't want to go on. It's not necessarily like that. It's more like, she says, she tries to use this analogy of, think of newborns who sleep less and less as they get older, right? Sort of, they need lots of sleep for obvious reasons, right? They're basically just growing. Everything in them is growing. And so they need a lot of sleep. But she tries to kind of make it this idea where it's like the newborn comes into the world and is sort of preparing themselves to come into the world by sleeping less and less and less, right? And they're up a little bit more, and then up a little bit more a little bit later, and then a year later, months later, whatever, they're up a little bit more. And then eventually you're just kind of sleeping regularly like everyone else. And she says we can think of the acceptance stage and this common thing that happens where people are sleeping more and more as the kind of reverse of that, where there's this thought that maybe they're preparing themselves to leave the world, as opposed to the newborn or the young infant who's kind of, their body is preparing them to enter the world, right? To grow and be able to engage in the world and not need as much sleep, right? So you get this opposite effect where the person who's accepted their death eventually is kind of slowly but surely preparing themselves for the final sleep, right? To close their eyes forever, as she puts it. And so this is another kind of interesting analogy. I like the child analogy earlier with the bargaining stage. And I mean, this is obviously sort of metaphorical, but it's an interesting way of thinking about this process. And it's an interesting question of whether there's any sort of truth to that, sort of psychologically. Maybe there's some psychological or cognitive scientific work that could be done to kind of figure that out. I don't know if there actually is, but it's an interesting question about this, and whether it's even, how empirically true it is that this is a common thing. We'd have to know when people were in the acceptance stage, who are terminally ill, and then, do some studies and see like what their sleep patterns are like. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting idea, and it at least a helpful idea to see kind of her point here, which is that acceptance is not about sort of being happy and thinking that your life is good that your death, your imminent death is a good thing. It's not like that. It's more about just the person recognizing themselves that the struggle's over. Right? That the struggle's over. I'm going to die, and I'm going to go ahead and sort of embrace that. And of course, kind of like the denial disappearing, the acceptance will kind of gradually come on as they work their way through depression and so forth. And as the as the acceptance kind of gradually comes on, you might think that what she would want to say is that sort of coincides with this sleep progression. So the point is just that gradually the person becomes more willing to accept the fact that they are going to die. And in the accepted stage, what that means is that comes out as this end to their struggle, this end to the resistance of their own death. Right? And in doing that, not just because they're sleeping more, but there's a kind of voidness in their feeling, a void in their feelings, because there's this unwillingness to go back to that struggle. Right? There's the willingness to engage with other people, with the doctors, with their family. People kind of, a sort of isolation comes back, that they don't want to do it anymore, and they're worried that, especially talking probably to clinicians, but their family as well, because acceptance is a really hard thing for families. The family often has a much, much harder time with acceptance than the patient themselves, because they want them to fight and live on, obviously, and they're not the ones in their shoes, right? But they're not resisting anymore. They don't want to be cheered up. There's nothing there to be cheered up anymore. They're not resisting anymore. That's the idea. And so their willingness to engage will diminish. Okay. But this is kind of what I was just about to get at. There's this thought, because it's so hard for the family, there can be a sense that the person might be giving up too early. And so acceptance, like giving up, in early stages, maybe in depression especially, but even in bargaining or anger, and maybe even denial, like just in the early stages, there might be this sense of like giving up. You want to quit early or something like that. You're like refusing treatments that actually may give you like a more quality of life, and live a little longer or whatever. And you're just like, what's another 2 months? Who freaking cares? And you're like this kind of give up attitude. And it might make sense sort of more early on for families to be resistant to that and to try to want to cheer you out, not cheer you out of that, but sort of cheer you up and make you more hopeful and see the promise and continue your life and so on. It can make sense. And so it can seem like patients want to give up too early when they're in the acceptance stage. It can seem that way to family members because they have this natural desire to want them to keep living, right? So that's just kind of what I was just saying. The early stages can have this kind of hopelessness, right? But it can be appropriate at that point to encourage them, to tell them don't give up so early, right? But acceptance from the outside can look like that as well. And as the struggle wanes, because again, acceptance is a kind of ending of the struggle against your death. And as that struggle wanes, they just don't care anymore about struggling, right? They don't care anymore about discussing it, how they're feeling about it. I don't want to cheer me up. I don't need you to find hope anymore. I've accepted. I'm ready, right? And that can make people feel like they're giving up, right? But if they're in fact in the acceptance stage and they have come to terms and worked through their depression and come to terms with their life as they've lived it, maybe they've found that hope in the meaning of their life, it's not a good idea to treat them as if they're giving up too early. If in fact they're in the acceptance stage in a kind of a good way, right? They've worked through all that other stuff. We wouldn't want them to lose that hope again, lose that acceptance, and then to die with the depressed feelings or something like that. And she wants to warn us that, like, look, this is our own fears. They're giving up. Wait, this is again our own fears of death coming back. Right? So what do? Again, it's quite simple for her. We understand the patient. right? We understand the patient. She gives us an example of a person whose family, at least I think the wife of this man, kind of mixed up their giving up and their acceptance. But then you can think about how they were beforehand, up to that point, right? Have they been really sort of accepting of treatments and discussions and so on? Have they changed recently, right? What do they feel now? Are they telling you that they're ready to die? That they don't want any more prodding and probing of them in these treatments? It's just not worth it to them anymore. I'm ready. I don't want to be prolonged anymore, right? What are they telling us? And again, how is their behavior towards treatments, discussions, whatever, has it changed? Is that telling us something about their present behavior? Okay. This kind of stuff. Be aware of our own biases towards death, our own desire to have the person live. This woman who was dying, who just really wanted her, I think it was a woman who wanted her husband. It might have been a husband who wanted his wife, but one spouse really wanted the other spouse to come to acceptance as well. They had come to acceptance, they were ready to die, but their spouse just kind of wasn't. And their continued attitude that they wanted their spouse to live, which just made it harder on the person who had already come to acceptance. They couldn't really even, I don't want to say enjoy their acceptance, but they couldn't even really experience their acceptance because their spouse hadn't got there and kept pushing it, right? And so we need to be aware of this. We need to understand the patient, talk to them, modify or be observant of their behaviors, be observant of our own behaviors. How have things changed? Because that will tell us how their attitude has changed. But we really need to be aware of our own biases and how that's affecting the patient. So this all-important thing of just coming back to the patient experience and understanding it, that's really going to be important for dealing with any of these stages. Okay. Now, let's wrap up a little bit. Let's keep in mind what the stages are. Because remember, these can be called the stages of grief. It's not always just any grief. This is about coping mechanisms that people who are facing their own death, their own imminent death, this is what they go through. And a lot of times their families, by proxy. People jump around. Sometimes they don't have to hit a stage even. And so keep in mind what these stages are. The way in which she is actually describing the stages as things that are not mechanical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. People jump around. Sometimes people even skip some. And then, in light of that, recall the criticisms and reservations about this model that we talked about last week, right? The empirical evidence that doesn't seem to be behind it. What doesn't really have it. It's just based on anecdotal interviews, right? There's not really a body of empirical work that sort of supports this model. Is the model even testable? These are questions that we should keep in mind. Now, just quick run through. Denial and anger, initial reactions, right? But where do they come from? She emphasizes this natural instinctive fear towards death. And importantly, right, so we have that. But importantly, how modernity has influenced and exacerbated that fear of death and pushed death to the outskirts, putting our grandparents in homes, closed caskets, makeup for the dead to make them look sleeping, all these kinds of things. Just medicine being about prolonging life. Denial and anger are really natural reactions to the fact of our own death, our own imminent death, but they're also exacerbated by the way in which medicine is set up currently, or was at least in her time, and it's probably still a lot that way. But then these turn to bargaining, right? This partial acknowledgement and partial denial of the reality of one's own death. Okay, the acknowledgement is that you can't deny or anger your way out of death, right? You start to recognize I can't just deny this and then it's going to go away. I can't just ostrich myself and put my head in the sand. I also can't beat up death. I can't get so mad that it's going to run away, right? Once you acknowledge that, but you still have some partial denial, right? You still assume that the fact is negotiable. Starting with the reality itself, okay, it is a fact, but can we change that fact? Okay, it is a fact, but can we push off that fact to a later time? Okay, it is a fact, but can we have the fact my way? Can it be less painful? Can I see my dad first? These kinds of things, right? But then depression comes in with this kind of more full acknowledgement of what's actually happening. I called it a proto-acceptance here. This is like almost accepting, right? Not accepting in her sense, but basically accepting the reality. And guess what? That reality sucks, right? It's really terrible. You've lost a bunch of stuff like your possessions and your body in a certain sense, and that's terrible, right? But also the impending form. The two great losses, your own life and everything that you love. Right? These are really, really depressing and hard to deal with. So it makes sense that they're depressed, right? And it reverts back to the past. Right? The hope shifts. It's no longer a hope about living more because you've pretty much fully accepted the reality anyways of your death. I mean, you might not be ready to die, which is sort of her understanding of acceptance, but you've acknowledged the reality. And guess what? It sucks. And so your hope shifts from living more to a hope that your life was lived well, was meaningful. A hope that you'll get to resolve your unfinished things so that your life can have meaning. Just look back. Should I feel guilty? Should I feel regretful? Should I feel content that my life was meaningful? Right? And helping them find that value in their life. Helping them make sense of the fact that they should be depressed because their life and all their loved ones and the relationships they had with them were really, really valuable things. And so you should be sad for a while and deal with that. And let's work through it, right? And then acceptance. That's the only way to get to acceptance, right? It's not just fully acknowledging that you'll die. That's kind of like this, because that's really depressing, right? It's not happy, but it's a kind of end to this awful struggle they've been going through. And this readiness to stop struggling, right? It's not a giving up. That's different. It's a readiness to stop struggling. And again, families have a really hard time with this, more so than even the patients. As she notes, the patients almost always are in acceptance before the family. Okay. And finally, this strategy that she keeps coming back to, knowing the patient, and in particular, knowing where their struggles are coming from, the kinds of things that they've experienced, the hang-ups that they might have that are making it harder for them to deal with this situation they're in, and helping them work through that stuff, letting them speak their experience. That can help us learn about them, first of all, but it's just a way for them to cope. It's a way to make them feel like people care and like they're valuable, which, as we've seen, is just really important, right? But also ourselves. Okay, so we need to realize where their feelings are coming from. We communicate with them, hear their stories. That's healing for them. But we cannot face someone else and their death, and we cannot help them through it if we can't face our own death and our own mortality. And so that's a central key. All right. That is Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Death. Thanks.